What's good, beautiful people? The Black Thumb here, and today we're going to be talking about the biggest mistakes that beginner orchid parents make when they are caring for their Phalaenopsis orchids. So let's get into it. Okay, so let's start with the most common mistake that people make when they are caring for their Phalaenopsis orchids, and that mistake is overwatering. So again, orchids do love water and moisture around their roots, but they don't like so much water that they are drowning. And so if you tend to be a little more heavy-handed with your watering, if you're the type of person that likes to water plants every day or every other day, then this is for you, because orchids don't need water that often. So in general terms, orchids need water in the warmer months every 7 to 10 days, and in the cooler months, every 10 to 14 days. And there are a couple of different ways that you can water. You can water from the top, where you literally pour the water over the top of the potting media, let it drain out of the bottom of the pot. And that will help to kind of flush out any salts and minerals that might get stuck in the potting media over time. And that's a great way to water your orchid. The other way to water your orchid is watering from the bottom. So using a bowl or a decorative pot that doesn't have drainage, pouring a little water into that pot or into that bowl, and then sitting your orchid in there to allow it to absorb that moisture up through the potting media and into the roots and eventually into the leaves to help it grow and thrive. One of the ways to decrease your risk of overwatering is to do a couple of things. Number one, you can use a moisture meter. And this meter here will allow you to basically dip the bottom part that has sensors to the moisture. You dip it into the potting media, and then it'll read out on the screen how wet or how dry your potting media is. And so if your potting media tends to be on the more dry side or completely dry, that means it's time to water. If it's still moist or still wet, then you want to wait a little bit more time before you water again. Now, the other method that you can use is called the finger method, where you literally dip your finger into the top of the potting media. If the top inch or two of that potting media is completely dry, then that typically is an indicator that the orchid is ready for more water. If it's still moist or still damp, then you want to leave it alone and double check in a day or two and see if it is ready for water. So again, overwatering is the number one reason why orchids die. So you want to love on your orchid, but you don't want to give it so much love that it becomes a detriment to its overall health, wellness, and growth and development. So that's the number one reason. The second reason, or the second common mistake that people make, is underwatering. So going in the complete opposite direction. And typically this comes from the school of thought that you should just put a couple of ice cubes on your orchid every handful of days, and that should be a sufficient enough amount of water for the orchid to thrive. And I am here to tell you that that probably isn't true. Now, I will say that with the caveat, I do know people, and I've heard from folks in the plant community that have used orchids or have used ice to water their orchids successfully. But again, a lot of that will depend on how often you're putting those ice cubes on, the temperature, the environment, the humidity, the climate that orchid is in, whether it's in your home or the larger climate that you live in, whether you live in a more humid area or a more dry area. All of these factors will determine whether or not your orchid can be healthy with that amount of water. Now, in general, remember, we want to try to replicate the natural habitat of an orchid in our home. And so we want to try to mirror how that orchid lives in the wild in our home. And so most orchids live in tropical places. They live in temperate places where the humidity is relatively high, the temperatures are relatively high, and there's lots of moisture around the plant. So there are no ice cubes in tropical environments. There typically isn't much snow in tropical environments. And so sometimes using ice is, number one, probably not enough water for your orchid, especially if you're only gonna do it once or even twice a week, putting a few ice cubes on the top of the potting media. The other thing that the ice could do that could be detrimental to the orchid is that it could shock the roots, especially if there are roots exposed at the surface and you put a piece of ice on it. You could be freezing out some of the viable parts of the orchid, which could then cause detrimental effects to the orchid overall. So if you're someone that tends to underwater your plants or tends to forget to water your plants, then you might want to think about using a potting media that has a little bit more sphagnum moss in it, because the sphagnum moss will hold moisture for longer periods of time, which will give you a little bit of wiggle room and a little bit of grace if you are someone that tends to forget to water or leans more towards underwatering. The other thing that you should also use is, obviously, you should use your moisture meter and maybe set a reminder or two for yourself to use this meter every so often to double check the moisture balance and the moisture content of your potting media, so that you know that your orchid is getting enough moisture without getting too much or too little. Now, in some special situations, if you are able to collect rainwater, or if you live in a place where it rains a fair amount and you're in a position to collect rainwater, rainwater is one of the best things that you can do to use to water your orchids, because again, it will mimic the type of water that it gets in its natural habitat when it grows in the wild. And then in general, I would recommend that you stay away from using ice cubes to water your orchids, and just use lukewarm water from your sink, especially if you live in an area where your water tends to be a little softer and not quite as hard. And if you do live in an area where your water isn't necessarily safe for plants, you can always use distilled water or spring water from your local grocery store. But the important thing is that you are finding the sweet spot between overwatering and underwatering, so that your orchid continues to be healthy and thrives. So that is number 2. All right, so the third common mistake that new orchid parents make when they are caring for their new Phalaenopsis orchids is using the wrong potting media. So, and I definitely fell victim to this early in my orchid journey, when I was just flying by the seat of my pants and didn't really do a bunch of research. But some people sometimes assume that orchids are just like any other indoor houseplant, and so you can use a regular potting mix or potting soil to grow your orchids in. But that is actually not the case. So remember, in the wild, orchids don't necessarily grow in the ground, although there are some species of orchids that are what we call terrestrial orchids, meaning they will grow in the ground. And maybe I'll do a separate video on those types of orchids and what their care routines and what helps them thrive both in your home and in the wild. But for the purposes of this video and for the purposes of Phalaenopsis orchids, these are orchids that typically are epiphytic, meaning they will grow on trees and attach themselves to things and use the surfaces to gather nutrients as the rain comes down those surfaces. And so we want to think about that as we are potting our orchids in their pots. And so we want to make sure that the potting media or the potting mix is a chunky mix, typically of bark, sphagnum moss, charcoal, and then something inert or inorganic, I should say, like perlite. And all of these things mixed together in one potting mix gives a nice mixture of material that, number one, is organic, that will help to feed the plant and provide nutrients to the plant, but it also allows for lots of airflow and lots of drainage so that the roots aren't smothered and aren't at an increased risk of rotting and your orchid dying as a result of that. So again, you want to stay away from your traditional potting soils and the dirt that you're using to start, like, let's say, a veggie garden, or to pot up a pothos or some of your other popular indoor plants. And instead, you want to get a mixed media potting mix that typically consists of bark, sphagnum moss, charcoal, and potentially something like perlite. And those 4 or 5 ingredients combined should give you a lot of positive feedback in the sense that it's going to allow for lots of good drainage. It's going to also allow for airflow to the roots. And it's also going to allow some moisture retention with the sphagnum moss being in that potting media. So that is how you avoid things like root rot, crown rot, other fungal and bacterial infections by using a proper potting media that's going to allow your orchid to thrive and really try to mirror how this orchid grows in its natural habitat in the wild. And then the 4th common mistake that people make when growing orchids and growing Phalaenopsis orchids in general is using the wrong pot or using pots that don't have a fair amount of drainage. And so whenever you are thinking about growing your orchids, again, orchids grow pretty free in the wild and they don't have a bunch of confinement. And so there's lots of drainage around those roots. There's lots of airflow around those roots. And so we want to replicate that in our home with the growing conditions that we have. And so how you avoid decreased drainage, which could lead to things like root rot, crown rot, fungal infections, bacteria infections, is making sure you are using pots that have lots of drainage, either in the bottom or even along the sides. And so obviously plastic pots are a great way to do it. There are also terracotta pots that have slits in the sides and holes in the bottom so that you have adequate drainage, but you can also get very good airflow across the board. And then there are also ceramic pots that also have drainage at the bottom, but also have cutouts or drainage along the sides, so that you are not running the risk or having so much moisture around those roots that it doesn't dry out soon enough and those roots start to rot and start to break down and essentially could lead to killing your orchid. So again, common mistake is not having adequate drainage and airflow around your orchid. And so making sure that you have pots that have that drainage, whether it's at the bottom, on the sides, or a combination of the two, are going to be super important to the overall health, wellness, and growth of your Phalaenopsis orchids. All right, so the 5th and final common mistake that new orchid parents make when it comes to caring for their Phalaenopsis orchids is thinking that they should cut the roots off of the orchids that are growing outside of the pot. And so I am here to tell you that you should never, ever, ever cut these roots that are growing outside of the pot, because these roots are viable and they are still contributing to the overall health, wellness, and growth of your orchid. These roots, also known as air roots or aerial roots, will literally take moisture from the air, from the environment, and will feed the plant. Now, there are some things that you can do with these roots that are growing outside of the pot that can kind of set yourself up and set the orchid up to continue to have success in its growing cycles. You can do things like misting these roots here so that they are getting adequate water and not just relying on the moisture that may be in the air, especially if you live in an area that tends to have a little less humidity, or there's a little less humidity in your home overall. These roots will dry up and they will shrivel up if you're not misting them consistently or if they're not getting water consistently. The other thing that you can do with these roots is when it comes time to repot your orchid again, you can do your best to kind of wrangle the roots that are growing outside of the pot into the new pot so that they will then continue to develop below the surface. But at that point, they can get consistent water that will obviously contribute to the overall health and wellness of the plant. So in general, you do not ever, ever, ever want to cut a viable root, whether it is growing beneath the surface of the orchid or beneath the surface of the pot or above and outside of the pot, because again, these roots are contributing so much to the health, wellness, growth, and development of your orchid. That is all I have for you today. These again are some of the common mistakes that folks make when they are just getting to know the orchid and how to care for the orchid. So if you can avoid these pitfalls here by using your moisture meters, to make sure you find the sweet spot for your watering, to make sure you're not overwatering and underwatering, making sure that you are using pots that have plenty of drainage holes to allow for that drainage and that airflow so that you're not putting your orchid at increased risk of root rot and crown rot and other bacterial and fungal infections. And then making sure that you are taking care of the roots that are growing beneath the surface of the pot, as well as taking care of the roots and preserving the roots that are growing above the surface of the pot and outside of the pot. And if you do these things and look out for these 4 or 5 pitfalls, it will go a long way in growing successful, healthy, thriving Phalaenopsis orchids. So again, I hope this video was helpful. If so, please go out and subscribe to my channel. Make sure you like, comment, and share, and let me know if there are any common mistakes that you've seen, and whether it's from you or from other people that you've seen, and hit me up in the comments and let me know what you all think. And as always, I hope that helps and your orchids keep blooming.